Hello, dear friends. Today we're going to paint a Greek courtyard together. To make sure it fits perfectly on our sheet of paper, let's start by marking some basic points that will help you position the main elements. The main elements are the semicircular entrance to a building, and we need to leave enough space for the background, maybe a view of the church. It might be a bit tricky to create this semicircle, so try to focus on it. Make sure the space for the sky and the background are evenly distributed in width on both sides. This way, the edges of the drawing should be about the same size. Don't press too hard on the paper. Watercolor paper is soft and doesn't like that. Try to sketch lightly with your pencil. A mechanical pencil is great for this because it leaves less mess. To position the door correctly, pay attention to the negative space. That's the space around the door, not the door itself. The door is a rectangle, and you want to make sure it fits neatly into this semicircle. I personally find it easier to focus on the points where the corners of the rectangle, the door, interact with the walls of the building. That's where the space forms a small triangle or a curve. You might see it as a small semicircle left by the door. It will help guide you. The path leading to the door is a bit tricky to draw, but not too hard. It has a slight slope and forms a small step toward the door. It makes it more interesting to tackle these details. Don't worry about getting the lines perfectly straight. They can be slightly uneven, and that's what will make it look more realistic. As for the vase, it has a slightly irregular oval shape, kind of like an egg that's been cut off at the top. It's sharper towards the top and wider at the bottom, with a blunt end. For the bushes at the bottom, I'm not sketching them right now. They'll appear naturally as we paint. It's easier to paint them in a loose, free style, and we'll do just that to capture their essence. As soon as we add some branches and elements, we start to lose that loose, free style. Also, when placing the pots, make sure they're far enough from the wall so they don't create the effect of pressing into it. The edges of the pot should not press into the wall. The straight line of the wall should remain straight and not visually deform from the pot's shape. The church in the background is placed roughly in the middle of the remaining space in the background. The dome itself is centred. Below the church, there are some unclear details, but don't worry about drawing them exactly. In fact, you don't need to. If you try to include every little detail, you'll just waste time, get confused, and most likely weigh down the background too much, drawing attention away from the foreground. It's better to leave it a little blurry and undefined. Focus on the most obvious elements, maybe a few projections, a semicircular shape, and a little tree will appear. We'll paint the tree with watercolours later. Overall, the sketch is pretty quick. The most challenging part is positioning everything correctly so that it fits on the sheet. And for me personally, getting that semicircle right and placing the door correctly inside it. Once that's in place, the rest of the process becomes much simpler and faster. Oh, and there's a sign above the door. By the way, the edge of the sign closest to us can slightly expand, but it's not a big deal and won't be very noticeable. Actually, in the end, it's hidden quite a bit behind the bush, so you can barely see it. Now let's start working with colour. If you're unsure about the colour, test it out beforehand on a scrap piece of paper, then start working on the wet paper. This is especially important when working with wet-on-wet techniques, because we often worry the paper will dry too quickly and we won't have enough time to mix the right colour. For this piece, I'm going to create a gradient from a darker, richer blue to a lighter one. I'm using Van Gogh ultramarine paint straight from the tube. I really like it for a bright, clear sky. You could also use a bright blue with a little violet. I wouldn't recommend using the ultramarine from Nevskaya Palitra with granulation though. In my opinion, it's not ideal for a smooth, clear sky like this. Granulation would distract from the smoothness of the sky, but that's just my personal preference. I've wet the whole sheet, or rather not the whole sheet, but all the space for the sky. Sorry about that. I've left the church and the building outlines dry. Starting from the top, I'm adding colour, a little more intensely than I would normally, because colours tend to dry lighter when working on wet paper. You can tilt your board or the sheet at an angle to make it easier to blend. As the colour begins to spread, I'm pulling the edges of the colour down. The sky will gradually get lighter as we approach the horizon, and I want to capture that effect with this gradient technique. This technique might require some practice, but once you get the hang of it, it will come naturally. If you're having trouble with smooth, even gradients, try it on smaller pieces of paper first. It's really fun experimenting with different colours and stretching them out like this. The key here is that you're gently pulling the colour down and the edges will gradually fade. If your brush picks up too much colour, you can wipe it off. One thing to remember, your paper will lighten as it dries, so use slightly brighter colours than you think you need, depending on how much the paper will fade. Next, we'll start working on the background with the church. Technically, we could wait for the sky to dry, but I'm feeling lazy and want to continue right now. If your paper is still very wet and you're worried about the colours running uncontrollably, it's better to wait. For the church, I'm using two colours, ultramarine and bright blue. The shadow side of the church will be ultramarine and it will gradually transition into the blue. The blue will fade out even more, becoming a very light shade. So you'll get this gradient transition from ultramarine to blue, and then the blue will fade to almost nothing. If you find it difficult to control the amount of moisture and pigment on your brush, you can switch to a smaller one. It can be tricky to go from working with a large gradient to more detailed work on the dome, but take your time to get comfortable. The more comfortable you are with the paper and brushes, the better your painting will turn out. Now I'm going to continue filling in the white of the church's building, and I'll be working wet on wet as well. Now I'm wetting the entire wall area, all the way up to this little fence that separates the road. There's also a small white roof on the fence. Here, I'll be playing with the contrast between the cool shadows and the warm spots of light. This effect is something you often see on white walls when they're hit by warm sunlight. The shadows in the background will be a little darker in tone than those in the foreground. That's why it's good that we're starting with the background, as it makes it easier to adjust. The wall of the nearer house should be just a bit lighter than the background, so remember, colour will fade slightly when it dries. What you're seeing now is a darker colour, but as it dries it will become more faded, so keep that in mind. If it's tricky right now, don't worry. If you don't get the colours quite right, just keep practicing. One trick is to make test swatches and keep a scrap piece of paper nearby where you can test and tweak your colours. It really helps when you're still learning how much paint to load on your brush. Take a closer look at where the cooler areas are. These are the parts in shadow. they'll gradually transition into a warm ochre colour. For the shadows, I'm using a mix of ultramarine and brown. It gives a bluish-grey tone, but it's more blue than grey. These cool blue shadows look really nice because they highlight the pure whiteness of the buildings. If you make the shadows grey, the whole scene will look dull and overcast, which isn't the vibe we're going for. Blue shadows give the scene a sunny, fresh atmosphere, which works so much better for a bright and clean look. Be careful when placing your colours next to each other. Don't mix them too much. If you mix ochre and blue, you'll get green, and that's not the effect we want right now. Also, I'm adding the trees wet on wet. My paper is still tilted, and I'm letting the trees spread out in those lovely blotchy shapes. Be careful with the blotches. Depending on the type of paper, they can spread more or less. To figure out how much to add without the paint running everywhere. It's a good idea to experiment. And remember, some papers absorb more water than others. Some might need more pigment and water, others less. The green and ochre I'm using for the trees isn't very intense or bright, so it won't overwhelm the scene. I don't really want to use the word grey too much, because I feel like it can make things sound dull. I often see people making the shadows too grey, but it's more of a bluish grey, if you ask me. Let's call it a bluish grey, shall we? Leave that beautiful, clean blue in the shadows. Pure blue looks pretty unnatural, almost like it's been filtered through a photo lens. When shadows turn too grey, especially if you start mixing in black, it gets really dreary, and that's not the vibe we want. Now, I didn't try to replicate the architecture exactly here. Instead, I focused on showing the flow of colours and transitions without clear-cut borders. This gives the impression that there's something interesting and varied in the scene, even if it's not a perfect replica. Now I'm moving closer to the fence. There's this section where the fence ends and the building begins, and it's the coldest part of the scene. It's got that bluish tint. Above it, it warms up a bit, and that's where I'll add some ochre. I think this piece is really a tribute to colourful washes, because everywhere, on the bricks, on the ground, there's this effect where the colours stand next to each other, not mixed, creating this rich texture. Notice how I'm barely touching the paper with the tip of my brush, because I'm working wet on wet to get those soft multicoloured washes. This creates smooth blended transitions that are just beautiful and magical. You could almost say the watercolour is working its magic on its own. Here, I'm filling in the wall behind a bush, but I'm not too worried about the bush itself for now. The wall will never stay pure white, but I'm keeping the tone light so it won't interfere with the bush's colour. I'll work with the wall this way for the rest of the piece. Higher up there will be warm ochre spots, and lower down cooler shadows, though the tone will be lighter than the shadows on the church. Honestly, when the piece is done, you might hardly notice the difference, but I'm happy with the result. As I've said, this is a work of colourful washes, and I'll also be using this technique for the sign. The main colour I'm working with for the sign is ochre, and I'm using a wet wash for this, not a dry brush. The wash is quite wet, and I'm carefully adding darker brown tones around the edges. You can use any brown you like. Something with a reddish tint works well, like Indian red or caput mortuum. There are so many options here, so pick whatever brown you have. The main point is to create this vintage, weathered look. In the foreground, I've got what looks like concrete, or something grey, filling this little threshold. For the grey, I don't use pure black. I really like the mix of ultramarine from Van Gogh and Sienna. But really, you can use any brown you like. Depending on the shade, it'll either be more purple or more green. A neutral brown gives you an interesting colour, just right for representing concrete. You can mix any other grey you like, and I encourage you to experiment. There are so many shades of grey. Some lean more purple, some more green, and by blending them you'll find your favourites for different purposes. Grey isn't just diluted black, it's much more versatile. In fact, it's rare that I or many other artists use pure black to create grey. Now, about the path in the foreground. It's the most saturated and vibrant part of the painting because it's closest to us. The bright bricks are a perfect example of when watercolour does most of the work for you. I'm adding a little bit of ultramarine here in spots, just loosely, along with a touch of ochre. Notice that I didn't pre-draw the bricks, and that's something I love about watercolour. You can always enhance those shapes later with the natural flow of the paint. For example, you can highlight where the bricks are by accentuating the natural blending of the colour. Just keep in mind that the bricks closest to us will be bigger, and the ones farther away will be smaller. I've already made some little marks to suggest the bricks, but you can always add more once the paint starts drying. I don't want the bricks to stand out too much, though. After all, the path is not the main focus here. It's the door and the bush that I want to draw attention to. So, I keep the bricks loose and soft. I'm also adding a little shadow to the wall. It's subtle, just a bit of a bluish shadow to show some depth. And I've been thinking about emphasising some cracks in the wall, just a few more lines to bring them out, as they got a bit faded once the paint dried. Thanks for watching my video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you want even more lessons, check out my Patreon. I'd also be grateful for any donations, and you can find all the ways to support in the description. All right, let's keep going. For now, my wall still looks pretty patchy, especially the building wall. Don't worry though, it will blend in a bit more later, especially once it gets hidden behind the bush. The shadow in the door frame is also not a single tone. It's cooler at the bottom and warmer at the top, with a lighter ochre section. These colours don't mix, they just transition from one to the other. I've checked if the wall is dry enough and it's almost there. I need it to be completely dry, so the paint doesn't spread too much. I want clear boundaries around the bush. I'm making the bush a bit more stylised than the photo. It won't be a perfect copy. As you can see, I didn't wait for the colour to dry fully here, and I rushed it. As a result, the paint bled into the corner. But, if you're following along, I recommend waiting for it to dry completely. Patience really pays off. So, I've got a rough idea of where the branches should go. They bend toward the door and even slightly overlap the sign. I'm using carmine with plenty of water on the brush. It's a nice saturated colour but not too thick. Having a lot of moisture in the brush helps create those beautiful, smooth transitions. These bushes look like a single wash, a multicoloured wash, to be exact. Now I'm going over it again with a bit of purple. I'm holding the brush farther back from the tip, which allows it to move more freely and create those fluid, erratic strokes. I've got a rough idea of where the bush should be, but I didn't sketch it out exactly because I didn't want the lines to restrict me. Instead, I'm relying on my instincts and feelings. The third colour I'm using for the bush is a warm red. You could even add a touch of orange mixed with carmine if you like. Next, I'm adding the green, which I made extra vibrant. It actually mixed a bit with the purple in some areas, so it's not as light and bright as I originally wanted. But I mix my own green, because I'm not a fan of pre-mixed greens. I combined blue and yellow, and it made this lovely, rich green. Now I'm filling in the leaves and branches. They're popping out in all directions, different sizes, moving in different ways. To make this bush as lively as possible, you have to let your hand move more freely, not too controlled. Look, I'm almost holding the brush at the top, letting it wobble more, so it moves freely and naturally. The closer we get to the end of the brush, the more control we lose. That's why I'm holding it lightly for the branches, but firmly for the vase, where I need more precision. I was right there, so I lowered myself closer to the edge and mixed up a dark green colour. For this, I added some purple to the green and, here and there, added a little more shadow to give the bush some depth. And I have to say, the bush turned out great. There's just one little thing, it ran into the corner a bit. I would have left that wall white or maybe added some shadow there, but I didn't want the bush to spill over like that. But now, I can't really fix it. The good news is, you can always add some extra touches, maybe some little scribbles or branches sticking out in different directions. Play around with it. Try making a few separate bushes on another piece of scrap paper, just to practice this movement. Trust me, once you get the hang of it, you'll be painting bushes with so much ease and joy. Now, just to repeat, the key here is to have a good amount of water and pigment on your brush, and to let your strokes be chaotic and free. Hold the brush higher up near the end, so it has more room to move. Let those erratic, quick movements happen naturally, and find your own rhythm. Let the brush flow. You can figure out where the branches might go, but don't overthink it. And now for the final step, adding the branches. A big mistake beginners often make, and trust me, I used to do this too, is drawing the branches first and then trying to add the leaves around them. But that's not how watercolour works. Watercolour is transparent, and you want to start with what's more visible. Usually the branches hide behind the leaves, so you can add them later. Plus, not drawing the branches right away gives you more freedom to move and adjust things. If you feel like the colour isn't intense enough, or if you made it too dark somewhere in the bush, no worries. You can always go back to your chaotic, wet, multicoloured washes and lighten things up or add more splashes of colour. Next, we're going to do another multi-layered, multicoloured wash. And this time it's going to be for the pot or vase, whatever you want to call it. We'll use some unexpected combinations of colours to give the pot a bit of a weathered, almost mouldy look, or like lime has settled on it. For this, I'm using a dark brown, something like burnt sienna, which will transition to ochre in the light areas. The area closest to us will be the darkest. I'll add some green to the shadowed part, and I'll mix it in with the leftover colour I used for the bush. I'm applying these patches and blobs of colour on the pot. Let the colours mingle and create those organic, random patterns. These little streaks will give us the direction we need for the bush and the pot's volume. To finish off, I'll add some clean or slightly dirty lines with a damp brush to create a sense of texture. Just let the brush do its thing, and the lines will form naturally. When it comes to colour, it's not too important what exact colour you use for the branches. The key is getting the direction right. Just sketch them out lightly over the wash. We don't need to define them perfectly. Some branches will catch the light, so they'll be lighter than the base colour, while others will be in shadow and darker. It's all about showing that change in colour. You don't have to worry about the exact shade. You can even use a clean brush to soften the lines, add some shadows, or use a slightly greyish brush to create those shadowy areas. Now, I'm mixing up a colour for the pots. For these, you can go with a colour similar to the one I used for the concrete, but with a more purple tone. You could mix a reddish brown with ultramarine for a really nice, interesting shade. It's not completely uniform, which works perfectly here. In the far pot, I'm actually breaking my own rule. Normally I'd start with the foliage, but here I'm doing the branches first because they're more visible in this one. The stem is really prominent, and the bush only has a little sprout at the top. So I started with the stem and then added the leaves. For the far-off bush, the movements are much smaller and more delicate. It might be younger or a different species altogether. The leaf strokes are smaller and finer, showing how this bush is farther away. You could add a bit of green to the leaves, but overall this bush probably fades behind the big one. Now, let's work on the door. How do we paint it while avoiding the leaves? No worries, there's no problem with leaving a bit of white space between the leaves. It's not necessary to outline every single one perfectly. If you try to get too precise, it'll look overworked, and we don't want that. Letting a little bit of the background show through, maybe even accidentally touching a leaf, will actually make the painting feel more natural and spontaneous. These kinds of sketches look alive and full of energy. Don't worry about making mistakes. Sometimes a little imperfection adds a shine to the leaves like they're sparkling in the sunlight. So let's go around the leaves and add some blue dots and splashes for the highlights. For the door, I'm using a blue colour with just a tiny bit of purple mixed in to give it a slight lavender tint. The blue starts off pretty intense, so be careful not to cover everything. You want to leave some space, so it doesn't get too thick. Don't make it too thick, leave a little bit of space for shadows. For the shadows, you can add a bit of brown to the same colour to darken it. But I'm not really focusing too much on the shadows. I'm keeping it pretty loose and free. Shadows aren't the first thing I want to make super detailed, because they're somewhat hidden behind the colours. I like it when there's a bit of an unfinished feel to the work, with some free and confident brush strokes that show it was done with a relaxed, sure hand. For the door pattern, I'm just showing the little squares or rectangles that divide it into sections. There's even a dark little window, but in the end it almost melted away, so now there's just a hint of a pattern that suggests the door has some design to it. Now, I'll tackle the window. I need to work around the leaves too. First, I'll do the light blue frame, then carefully fill it in with ochre or any brown you like. I'm not doing the frame and glass separately. I'm filling the whole area with ochre and then adding darker patches to show the window. I go around the leaves, and once that's done, I add little black splashes to represent the window's dark sections. You don't need to do this too wet. You can keep it drier, but don't worry if it runs a little and stays loose. It gives it that free, sketchy vibe. Now with a dry brush I add some texture to the wall in the foreground so it's not too bright and white. I want to show that the wall has a rough feel to it. The pink from the bush spilled over a bit, but that's okay. Just don't overdo it. The wall is still light, just a bit textured. You can hold the brush on its side to scratch lightly, or even use an old brush for that textured effect. Then there are some final details to add. It's best to look at your drawing and see where you want to add them. For me, I believe that less is more when it comes to details. Better to leave something undone than to overdo it. Don't feel like you need to draw every little line or every single edge. I did want to add a little more shadow to the pot. Maybe yours was already fine from the start, but I felt like I needed just a little more contrast to make the pot stand out. These final detail moments are hard to plan ahead for. They usually come at the end when the piece feels almost done. Right now, I'm following my intuition and just letting those spontaneous impulses guide me. But I also recommend that you do the same. Look at your work. Analyze it from the perspective of where it still feels too flat, where it's lacking something. For example, with the door, the black lines I added while it was wet ended up spreading out more than I expected. Maybe yours didn't spread as much, or maybe you didn't even need them there. Also with the bush, it feels like it's missing some volume, maybe more branches. And in that dark pink corner, I felt like I needed to justify its darkness, so I added a few more dark branches there. Honestly, the paint that spilled into that corner was a happy accident. I didn't want to redo it, but you might be able to avoid something like that if you want. And with that, we're done. I wish you the best of luck, and thank you for dedicating your time to drawing, for taking some time for yourself. I hope you're happy with your painting, and I encourage you to keep going, to try more and more. The more you practice, the better it gets. Keep going.